So hello everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the third cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today it's my great honor and pleasure to have as guest here, Markus Weisen. Markus Weisen undertakes PhD research on non-conscious dimensions of architectural encounter at the École Normale Supérieure of Paris. He uses the micro-phenomenology interview method. Peter Zumthor's Columba Museum is the case study building. He has a background in French and German literature and philosophy. He worked for 30 years in inclusive culture. He is trained in craniosacral therapy, which enhances awareness of internal bodily sensations. Markus, very happy that you're here with us. Please.
Okay, also es freut mich, auch so ein Stündchen mit euch zu teilen. I'm very happy to join you for an hour. And I just wanted to say it was a pleasure to meet Maria in Munich at a conference called Research Perspectives in Architecture, which you can download the proceedings, including Maria's and my article, free of charge in the Transcript Verlag. And before, means we will be talking a bit about experience, and experience is something very weird because it is at once so pervasive and so difficult to get a hold on it, it seems, at the very least in the Western world. And today, I don't want to be very intellectual. I am myself just very, very interested in experiencing places, in experiencing sensations, inner mental images, whatever it is, and come to reflecting on lived experience or on architecture through my own bodily experiences. So you have noticed I don't have an architect's background. And I thought to situate our talk a little bit, I would like to place it into a wider context. And that is not being a philosopher. I will give you a short lesson in kitchen philosophy. And saying that in Western culture, we have a profound distrust or mistrust for experience. And it has accelerated ever since the scientific revolution and also with rationalism in European philosophy. But not all cultures operate that way, putting experience at a distance, creating objects that stand in the background far away from which we are separated. For example, think of Buddhist spiritual philosophy. The Buddha would tell his followers, try out what I say. And if you don't agree or you find another result, well, change the teachings. And if I put that in context, it is a context of contemplative engagement, of mindfulness, but also very much a corporeal engagement of observing one's own bodily sensations and inner little films and doings that happen in us. So there are possibilities, civilizational ones, of thinking differently to the Western approach. In 20th century, in particular in the past 50 years or so, the mistrust has been strengthened, partly because of cognitive sciences. And there's nothing wrong about cognitive sciences, but cognitive sciences have masses of evidence. So scientific evidence, laboratory-based evidence that memories are so easily falsified. It seems that we humans like that game. We are not very good at keeping very clear memories in our minds. However, and memories are memories of experiences. However, when in the same laboratory setting, the conditions are created to open a space for greater attentiveness, then the error rates in such experiences where you need to recognize images passing very fast by a screen, you recognize more of them and the error rate drops. So it is not a very big evidence, these experiences are very rare, but it gives some degree of relativity to the great power of science. And to me, I can wonder, does it matter that experience is so unreliable or memory can be false? And I give you one example where I say, I really don't give it a S and I don't give it a damn. For example, I read Dostoevsky's novels 50 years ago, and I don't recall any single sentence in them, nothing precise whatsoever, but they keep on developing a transformative trajectory in me, and they are vibrantly present in my inner life, even to the point that today I can recall from reading The Possessed by Dostoevsky, which is the story of 19th century valueless nihilism, which ends in the burning of villages in a systematic way. It tells me, even though I haven't read that book for 50 years, that Vladimir Putin and Patriarch Kirill in Moscow are the very nihilists of 21st century, not the degenerate Western world and not the Ukrainians. So there is some degree of truth that I can detect in my 50-year-old memories. Also, they have left nothing very precise in terms of information and sentences, but certainly some very precise atmospheres and some compact distilled knowledge. So to me, that is arousing, how to say that, bit of experiential evidence of let's go for experience, let's go for working with our memories. And we have come not to trust our experience so much because of, as I said, a very long cultural history of putting it away from us. And I'd like to invite you, if you agree, to do something very, very simple. It's not dangerous at all. You will all survive that. But for example, take a little moment for yourselves to either recall or imagine or visualize being in a field or in a forest or in an orchard, whatever comes up to you as an image, and having a tree in front of you, maybe 5, 10, 15 meters. It doesn't matter what the season is, and feel completely free to let those images come up. You're in this imagination or memory, you're walking towards this tree. Is there something that put you into motion towards it? Is there something, perhaps a chestnut tree flowering, that calls you towards it? Is there a desire? And as you move towards it, a desire that you may not even be completely aware of. And as you move towards it and get closer to it, the tree gets closer to you. There's a kind of kinetic dance that happens every time you approach something. But in that space of movement, something changes also in the relationship to the tree. If you're one of those tree huggers, as there exists in Finland, which was the country of my mother, as there exists in India, you might also actually get a feel of the whole place and how you can touch it, or you might touch the tree trunk with your eyes, with the haptic capacity of the eyes to detect all those things. Within this experience, a large number of things happen, which are images, sensations, feelings, an affective relation, whatever. And I would say it's a shame that we spend so little time connecting with our listening abilities to such experiences. And I'd now like to offer you another 3 examples about how you as architects, designers, perhaps even urbanists, can relate to places. For example, imagine an international style window or window bay or any contemporary avatar of it. And you're kind of in front of it. Maybe move towards it, approach it if you wish? Is there something that spurs you? Is there something that puts you in motion? Is there something that lights up in you? Is there something that comes alive in you in this facing a rather lean, one-dimensional place most of the time? I leave you those answers, but they are examples which relate to writings in architectural phenomenology about the inhumanity of modern cities. So it's well worth confronting our experiences with the real thing and then to reread the texts and see whether the text becomes more alive to us in our triangular relationship, which also passes via experience. So I invite you to do another little exercise of imagination. Imagine now a window of a 17th, 18th century house, maybe 18th century, with small little rectangular window panes and their frames. Perhaps visualize a space around it, whether you're outside or inside. And is there something of a relationship developing? Is there some kind of delight, perhaps, in the light, in the materiality of the window frame, in its natural wood, perhaps, which is just polished, or perhaps repainted in a rather nice way? And isn't there something more there of a difficulty to describe quality of intimacy that you will not really get with an international style window bay? And this intimacy, if you look at it carefully, it's due to the fact that you're not completely bombarded by sheer modernist Corbusian light only, that kind of light of the light cult, but that actually the light that floods in there is already framed and filtered a little bit by the little window frames. And it brings you into touch with a little bit of penumbra. And when light plays on penumbra, the most beautiful things happen. It's an experience you can make in many churches. And the third experience is one you may not have had, but imagine now that this window is perhaps of a 16th or 17th century house, or a modern Shaker house in the northeast of the United States. And the window has little glass panes which are not industrially produced, but are hand and mouse blown. And you look at these and something of an experience of a completely different order comes in, because the world outside is mediated in a way by this slightly irregular, slightly reflective glass that slightly refracts in a slightly distortive way, that softens the view on the outside world. It's a completely different world that you see than that even of the 18th century window of roughly the same kind. So I gave you these examples because we really have millions of ways of practicing our own sensory abilities with nature, with urban sites, with industrial derelict sites, with houses, and so on. And to one of the great architectural writers of today, Juhani Pallasmaa, these types of experiences are more important than having lots of theory ingurgitated into you. And so is reading books like Dostoevsky, whom I mentioned. And now we can sort of move on to the slides and step a little bit further into the complex, elusive, evanescent, fleeting world of experience. Alberto Perez Gomes, whom you have heard in the seminars, or who is recorded online, said that these fleeting experiences have essential existential meaning. And so designing those things is a really important task. It doesn't seem that there is a PowerPoint coming. Do you see a PowerPoint?
Not yet, not yet. I'm trying to share it, but I'm having some difficulties.
So I'll tell you one more thing about fleeting experiences, and
yes,
it should be.
I think we are almost there.
But you have to restart.
We will, Marcus, we will just have to make a small pause in our recording, and then we will continue. I have to quit and reopen. Okay.
Okay. Yes, and we stay on.
You can stay on. Yes. See you in a moment.
I'll wait and.
So we will continue now. We experienced a few technical difficulties, but we sorted through. So I will share now Marcus' presentation in full screen.
Brilliant. So let's catch up where we left over.
Yes.
Do you still hear me all? Yeah, you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you, and we can see your presentation in full screen. So Marcus, please just give me a sign, say pass whenever you need me to pass the slide. Okay, so great. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can take the next slide. I don't see myself.
Okay.
So I don't know if you see me.
Yes, yes.
Brilliant.
Yes.
So
The vocal
slide.
is better. The next one? Yeah.
Yeah.
The slide isn't moving.
Oh my God.
I think Acrobat doesn't work in full screen.
Yeah. Oh. Okay.
So
let's try it one more time.
Brilliant.
Now it works? Okay.
Yes,
this is
yes,
the second
wonderful.
slide. Let's
Wonderful.
go.
So we left off after you did those little exercises of imagination, recall, or visualization, and no doubt a certain number of fleeting experiences came back into, if you want, liminal consciousness, or you could recall things. And one talks about these experiences often as pre-reflective, as evanescent, as fleeting. I mentioned that to Pérez Gomes. These experiences also carry essential architectural meaning. So it's worthwhile listening into them. And since there are so many women in your class, I also tell this story to men, but Alvar Aalto, this great Finnish architect, when he designed Villa Maria in 1932 or so, he said he was very interested in those everyday fleeting impressions that can be had in a kitchen. And his kitchens and buildings are very alive. And I don't think that Le Corbusier, if you ever get to see kitchens of his, will have this level of sensitive life where you feel enfolded and welcome than in Aalto's. So fleeting experiences indeed are useful. It's arguably difficult to approach lived experience, and that is why it's little being investigated. You had a wonderful talk by Sarah Williams-Goldhagen last year, and she wrote a book called Experiencing the Built Environment, in which she will, among others, study the agency of environments and how they make us act. And it's a very sharp, very clear, and also intellectually very powerful work. At some stage, she was really interested in writing a book about experience. And she had all those friends who told her, well, Sarah, you can't really write a book about what people are experiences in their environment. It's just too big a question. So she wrote this other wonderful book, which was an indirect way of looking at experience through the building and how it makes us act. It turns out that in my own research, I have the madness of approaching lived experience much more directly. You'll get to hear. Next slide.
Yes.
We have another quote by one of the speakers who will speak, I think, on 9th May, whom you should not miss at all. It's Harry Francis Mulgrave, who writes in From Object to Experience. A great deal of our experience is pre-reflective, but what pre-reflective is difficult to say. What his title of the book says is that yet we are embarked on a journey that goes from architecture as purely form, to architecture as being experienced, as being a verb, like Sarah Robinson says as well. That's a journey we have to go, but it's still a long journey, but it's an exciting one. Next slide. And on this journey, we're coming closer to lived experience, our feelings and sensations and all sorts of things that wake up through receiving them. I have noticed in the past 5 or 6 years, or 10 years, a kind of moderate optimism that our perceived boundaries of perception actually can be stretched and extended a little bit. So we have Jean-Paul Thibault, who is a great guy. I recommend reading him. He's also written in English. He's the founder of the International Network on Ambiences, Urban and Architectural Ambiences, which translates as Atmosphären in German, but includes in particular also the social dimension of creating Atmosphären. So the French notion ambiance is a little bit wider. And he speaks about the importance of letting sensory experience rise to the surface, by which he means the surface of consciousness. And then he says something interesting. It's about the socialization of sensory experience, which I take to mean two things. One is that if we are collectively and more engaged in having those difficult to word experiences, we end up creating wording for them. We end up creating a space for sharing about them. And we end up, in a sense, taking stewardship of a sensory commons that belongs to everyone, but that we can make grow. And the socialization of sensory experience is also just alone or with others, increase our sensory abilities. Thibault names this engagement a challenge, and in French, une épreuve, which means two things, an experience and a trial, like a trial of life. But we can make it playful, because a trial is also something we can try. There's something experimental about it. Next one. So another little quote on what I call a moderate optimism in stretching boundaries of sensory perception is by Xavier Bonneau, who teaches at École nationale Supérieure d'Architecture in La Villette in Paris, but he's also the director of GERFAO, in English, Group for the Study and Research on Philosophy, Architecture and Urbanness. And he also noticed the need for us to regenerate our sensory capacities. And that is, I would say, to stand steadfast and to resist to what Italo Calvino, the great Italian writer, writes, calls the endless, ceaseless rainfall of images from advertising, mass marketing, event culture, which are images which are not usually very deeply nurturing. And so he sees that necessity, and he says it's vital for inquiring, for questioning the new conditions of metropolitan environments, which for him are also environments marked by the Anthropocene, or as some call it, the Capitalocene. Yes, there is human individual responsibility involved, but it may well be that also of the mad capitalist system in which we work. And he sees a need for preserving all that. The interesting thing with him is then that he values the individual, the collective, and political dimension of coming back to our senses, and that the intimate contact with ourselves can actually be a political act of resistance. So that's a bit of food for thought. So here come a few, I would say, soft images about engaging with sensory experience. Here I am at K21 Düsseldorf with my blind friend Siegfried Saarberg. Just look at how he is seated, look at his position, look at how attentively he listens. We can learn to listen that way also to visual and multisensory experiences. Here, I took a picture in 2014 at the Sensing Spaces exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts, which was architectural installations. And this was the entry room by HFT and architects. And there was quite a throughput of people going. And weirdly, without even being called to do anything, people, as if by some invisible instruction, put themselves on the floor and lie down there. And they are usually under a huge, almost brutalist skylight, but that is very effective and that casts light onto this space. And that also makes the air vibrate. And so unconsciously, people are called to lie down and they get sensations. And when you look at the tonicity of their bodies, there is a degree of relaxation there, which tells me, as somebody who has done body work, that when this state is there, it is also a receptive mental state for letting experiences come to us and come into us and engage with them. And this picture from Jan Gehl's Life Between Buildings Using Public Space, published in Danish in 1971, is the only picture I saw illustrating something a bit similar about unconscious experience, which is partly automatic, almost biological, but on which also more conscious experience and sensory experiences that happen at the threshold of consciousness arise. So there is a great poverty in engaging with the most simple things we do every day. And I think we need to be a generation, I'm a bit old now, but that your generation takes up this torch and really steps into the world of sensory experiencing. It will enrich your life and your design work immeasurably. So here is an interesting one. I don't know whether it's a picture from Italy. It looks a little bit so with those sort of basilica style bricks. And if it is in Denmark, it is certainly in the high summer, because you have these columns, which when they are cold do not engage anyone into leaning onto them and developing a kind of coterie. And where you see this kind of synergy or alignment between those two men, it's a men's college, it looks like it. But on the right side, where even their body movements are leaning towards the column, just like my eyes and body is leaning and moving towards the sunshine or towards the projections of light in churches through the windows. So these kinds of things got me onto wanting to work with pre-reflective and non-conscious experiences. And so I don't think I have much time, but in 1 or 2 minutes, I will tell you in a few words what I'm doing as PhD research. So my research is experience-based. It's a very good word to remember. And I use what is called first and second person research. Now, those terminologies come from the fact that scientific research is third person. Experiences are made with people, but their own experiences are not recorded or are not recorded as lived experiences. When I interview, as I did, 20 people visiting Columba Museum in 30 interviews, I undertake second-person experience. And when I interview myself, or when I write about my own experiences, which I've come to do as well, it's first-person research. First-person and second-person research is generally not valued much in the research world. It's particularly the case so in phenomenology. And actually Siegfried Saarberg did a wonderful PhD in philosophy in first person, and I think it's a bit more allowed in Germany than in France, on his experience, multisensory and bodily, of traveling and of visiting and experiencing cityscapes. So that would be a whole PhD written in first person. My research on pre-reflective unconscious experiences takes place at Columba Museum by Peter Zumthor. And what I interview and what I write about my own experiences, I bring it into dialogue with Ioannis Pallasma's writings. Here is this extraordinary, you don't see it, sorry, I'll show it to you later. His writings have been incredibly encouraging because he also says since 1980, and in particular in The Eyes of the Skin, Die Augen der Haut, so it exists in German, that the biggest part of our experience is unconscious. And he says it well in The Eyes of the Skin. So I bring a kind of dialogue between the experiences I record and I describe with an interview method called micro-phenomenology. And the micro-phenomenology interview method is a method in which the interviewer supports the interviewee make contact with their lived experiences, usually of the recent past, maybe 10 minutes ago, an hour ago, 2 days ago. But it could be up to 40 years ago, as has happened to me once. I was interviewed on my memories of Solaris, an absolutely extraordinary film by Andrei Tarkovsky. So it could even do that if the experience is powerful. It uses a certain number of strategies to achieve that, because usually when we talk about our experiences, we say, yes, it was beautiful, I didn't like it, and it reminds me of 15th century late Gothic Rheinischer Stil, and so on. And we are there in judgments, in the intellect, but not so much about our corporeal feelings and sensory impressions. So for training for this interview, it takes about a week and it takes practice. And that's the interview method I used. And in just 2 sentences, a couple of findings, which also are shaping my PhD, and they were unpredicted, because I asked the interviewees after their pre-interview visit, where I asked them simply, where I said to them simply, I am interested in what you sense, feel, experience, images you may have, thoughts that may come up to you, and that there is no right and no wrong experience. Every experience is a right experience. But out of those 20 interviewees, 3 experiences were about joy, happiness, gratitude. Now think of that. If you know of literature in architecture or urbanism about happiness and joy, let me know, because I have found very few. And the whole of the Western world is poor on it. There is Friedrich Nietzsche, and there is Baruch Spinoza, and then it's about it. That means it's about it, unless we really want to rediscover medieval philosophy, where you have contemplative philosophic books about what is called spacious joy. It is a mystical, spiritual, contemplative bodily experience, which went together also with high-powered rational intellect of people like St. Thomas of Aquinas. So it's to me a little bit like if architecture, built environment would need to reclaim and rediscover joy, happiness, gratitude. So I had only 2 or 3 people who had those experiences. I do a deliberately qualitative thing. Not everybody would like that, but I stand up to it. Another thing that I found of great interest was that 2 of the 20 interviewees had an experience of improved bodily or mental well-being. One in seeing a Roman brick in the Ausgrabungsraum, in the room of excavations, which was sunlit because there was a hole in the wall on which the modern building is built. His sadness at the loss of his mother who had died lifted in the encounter with this moment. another person, a busy arts manager, comes to the museum quite frequently just to relax, to chill down. And she was in the Lesesaal, in the reading room, which has no clearly attributed function, and that does help. And as she was sitting, she tends to get more relaxed. And when I interviewed her about that, she also said, well, I think when you leave Columba Museum, you are no longer the same person. So I was a bit struck, also positively interested. And I said, can you recall a past experience where something like that happened to you, where you were no longer quite the same? And she takes like 10, 15 seconds and says, yes, last time I came and I got up onto my bike, I felt how my vertebral column straightened up. Now, to many people who are researchers and who are just rationally minded, it doesn't mean anything much. But anyone who is a dancer, without a column, you can't do anything. Anyone who is a Jewish Hasidic mystic or who is doing Kundalini in Hindu practices, or who does cranial osteopathy, and so on and so forth. To all of those people who have bodily practices or bodily spiritual practices, this moment of becoming aware of the body revitalizing itself, having had a transformative moment, is just deeply meaningful. And so I find out simply informally working with people who worked at the museum, talking to them, oh yes, there is this artist who comes along to the museum because she's depressed and she comes to see not the objects but the museum itself. And then in an interview I discovered by chance with Peter Zumthor that he says, yeah, after my talks there was an older woman who came to me and said, when I'm down, I come to the museum and it changes my mood. And I remembered then that at MIT House by Alvar Aalto in Boston, I came to the museum, to the students' hostel with a headache. And I spent 20 minutes in the foyer, a very famous place with a fireplace without a function, and my headache had lifted. And it was not just a figment of my imagination. So I got really, really intrigued by the healing powers of what is sometimes called healing spaces when you build hospital architecture with views on trees, which accelerates the healing process and have the hospital and insurances spend less money, but in particular give people a better time and a greater quality time. So I became really struck, and I will dedicate 20 or 30 pages of discussion about to the healing powers of architectures, because I think it is something we want to develop further. Why wouldn't we want to do that? So it's a little bit like bottom up, a few things came up. I spoke for far too long, so please forgive me, it's finished now.
It was fine. We might maybe take 10 minutes after 7, just so, because we experienced all these technical difficulties, and of course Marcus should have as much space as all the other speakers, and thank you so much. I will tell you in the end again, but this was a wonderful presentation, so thoughtful and so rich with all these layers of thought and feeling and association and memory together. Very, very enriching also for our conversations series. Thank you so much, Marcus. So I would just like maybe to start by asking, within the context of all that you shared with us in terms of your experience now with the PhD, with trying also to somehow fill this research gap that exists, that as you rightly mentioned, we are not really doing so much research about architecture and how architecture can be consciously designed to foster feelings of joy. There's a little bit of work on the area of well-being, as you also mentioned now in the end, in terms of specific settings like hospitals and so on, but also thinking that we don't need only to have architecture that inspires this kind of feelings only in specific settings or specific typologies, but in general, also in our workspace, for example. And I think that you really bring a point which is so important, and I was very happy to hear it, because very often I don't find other colleagues who bring this up. And I always try to bring into my classes and conversations this aspect of play and of joy as something that is to be taken seriously, as it affects our whole life, our whole creativity, and also, of course, our well-being. Also found extremely valuable that you make this connection between not only contemporary thoughts and also the work, of course, of Johanni Palasma in dialogue with your own work, and also with your Finnish heritage and the connection with the work of Alvar Aalto, which of course makes your own experience of Alvar Aalto even more deep and more meaningful, and perhaps makes you also even more tuned to the intentions of the architects, because you understand the culture. So I would like to ask if you, maybe a little bit of the time we have, if you could talk about your experience working with blind people, and how you in particular, with your own body sensorium, to which of course you, as a craniosacral therapist, you are also particularly attuned to all these experiences and sensations. How would you describe that the experience of working so closely with blind people, how did this affect your own sensorium and your perception of architecture?
It's a wonderful question, and I owe my companionship with blind people a hell of a lot. And I think it's important that in my own PhD, which is not about the experience of people with a disability, that I acknowledge that. So I give you two anecdotes. One is that in '85, Sylvie, a blind friend of mine with whom I studied at Geneva, came to visit me at Oxford, like some others with French friends. And I spent a whole week with her. And every day I was kind of undressed in my knowledge, because I tried to think of a vision of the world being beautiful because it is seen, like the English expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And in 1 week with Sylvie, looking at botanic gardens, college cloisters, all sorts of things with all the senses, I realized that no, beauty is not so much in the eye of the beholder, but it's in the body of the experiencer. And it led me to organizing something I called Oxford Through All the Senses, which was a multi-sensory cultural holiday for blind, partially sighted and sighted people. That was in 1987, where people explored musical instruments in the museum, to many places. And I took a group of them myself to St. John's College Library, arguably the least accessible place for blind people because the print can not be read. But in that 16th century library, there were books from 16th century onwards that could be touched. And we could go through the history of printing with the different weights of paper, the different quality of leather binding them, the different way it has been cut. And we were in a space that was, you could even feel the dust of intellectual concentration there and quiet. And after half an hour, the 14 or 15 of us ended up being silent. No one spoke, and not because those guys were bored. You could hear a pin drop on the floor. It was one of the most impressive experiences I had. It took me over 30 years to realize that if I call it atmosphere or ambience, this notion has heuristic value. And so I certainly got to learn a huge amount about atmospheres through blind people. I also learned something about aesthetics of low sight with William Kerbier, a visually impaired arts consultant who whilst preparing for this holiday, I showed him around in the English landscape garden, in the college, and I described him a weeping willow in the place, and he said, "Oh, shall we go down there?" And we went into it, and I never bothered going there, of course, because we are just a bit limited by the power of our eyesight. And then he said, "Oh, I can see the kind of light filters in the leaves." And for the first time, he could see light and shadow for a long time. With his peripheral vision, he could only see black and white. And he was quite moved by that experience. To me, it was just one of the half a dozen most important sensory experiences I had about what I could say from craniosacral therapy is that whether you do dance, whether you're a seasoned walker, whether you do karate, whatever, any bodily practice you have will also give you some wording to describe your inner anteroceptive and sometimes exteroceptive experiences. So in 2014, I found myself at the Chiasma Museum, of which I showed you a picture, and there was an exhibition by Mona Hatoum, who is an extraordinary Lebanese, British, Palestinian artist, who talks about the imprisonment of Palestinians, but also talks about a kind of universal form of imprisonment of all of us. And some of her works are very difficult because they provoke us. And I was in that museum by Stephen Hall, and there was a kind of round space into which you walked, and down on the floor was a screen, a circular screen, with images of visceras, which she had put into her body, and it was beating. It was very ugly, if you want. One may like that kind of aesthetics or not. Some people run away, some people delighted in it in the name of any kind of freedom. But I found some difficulties 30 years ago when I saw it for the first time. And I looked at it, and I like exposing myself to such tough things because they are very real as well. And there came a moment where I felt that I was held from behind by the wall. And that sensation of being held, sometimes architectural phenomenology speaks about it, but it came to me as an image, and I only became aware of it, I think 2 or 3 years later, a fundamental image in craniosacral practice. Usually you sit and there is a massage table, and the client or the person with whom you work lies on their backs, but not necessarily. And it's a non-invasive thing, and often you would hold, for example, your hands under some cranial bones. But the idea is that in our training, we give a holding space, and that we hold with our attention a white space that is wider than the peribodily space of the person with whom we work and ours. And I really realized that I became aware of being held by the wall only because I had done that craniosacral training. Some people will become aware of it without any training whatsoever. And then I spoke to Johanni Pallasmaa about that story because he was one of the associated architects and lives in Helsinki. And he just said in a very kind of very genuine, simple, everyday language, well, it's the hapticity of the building. Hapticity is an interesting thing because it isn't owned only by texture. It is actually a thing that is in between the building and its materiality and its texture and my perceptual capacities. It is a notion that goes beyond dualism. And indeed, the wall which you saw as a little girl ran up against the wall, which was basically that she did not need to find a space for protecting every personal space that usually is about 60 centimeters out of our body. We don't walk along walls because we don't feel so protected. She was playful. Something steered her into movement to run up the steps. Her father followed, it was an unconscious invitation. But in that very moment, if she was so close to this wall, I would also say that it had to do with a nice hapticity of the wall, including that treatment that there are little porous air bubbles in the drying of the cement that come in there that give it something slightly skin-like. So here is a moment where, through one's own experiences, which come from bodily practices, we are in a better position to recognize some aspects of architectural experience. But if you were a Qigong practitioner or a dancer in a dance form which trains and educates awareness to bodily feelings rather than a mechanical bodily perfection, you will come up with other embodied images. But not only embodied images that help you see better, there is a descriptive vocabulary that each of those knowledges brings up. So the idea of a holding space, I get it from osteopathy and craniosacral therapy, but I also get images, other kind of terms like the fluid body from osteopathy, which helps me understand architectural experiences better. And I do think that research can go much further if these forms of knowledges of the body rather than about the body can be drawn into research. In the meantime, we don't need to be scientific researchers. We can go out to the woods and to derelict urban environments, test the sensations and feelings we get in oppressive spaces, in welcoming spaces, and we will learn about architecture with our body.
Marcus, wonderful. Thank you so much for this comment. This is exactly what our students are going to do. And now there's many nodding heads. And I'm so happy because we had before a discussion about the Aufgabe, about the exercise. And I think that your contribution has been so valuable because it's really touching all the points of all the discussions we have been having. Your story about this experience with the visceral art and the experience of feeling being held by the wall reminded me of the hugging walls from the Teatros Anatomicus. I learned this from history of medicine because I have a younger sister who studied medicine, and I got very curious about these typologies. And the Teatros Anatomicus was a typology that was developed with a spatial configuration exactly to hug and hold, as you just described, the students of medicine when they were watching in the Teatro Anatomico, in the anatomical theater, when they were watching the dissections. So there was room for them. There was a kind of series of niches where they could lean on, very similar to the misericords from the church choir. And there was a small space where they could do what they had to do if they felt sick, which was also thoughtful and realistic considering the situation. So maybe we do need to connect a little bit more to the whole history of architecture to understand this kind of attentiveness to the human body, not just in extreme situations, but also just in general, to understand that. I also found very beautiful and exactly linked with these topics that in your presentation you had this wonderful picture from Jan Gehl with the gentleman leaning to the column. There's on the left side a group of people, and on the right side there's a kind of couple or two people, and he's not alone there. He came alone, but he is engaging in a dialogue with the column he's leaning onto, like a friend. It almost looks like he's exchanging some impressions from what he sees of the square with his friends. So thank you so much also for sharing this beautiful image, which I didn't know.
Two very quick things. One about this image of the column. I really believe that at such moments, the building or the environment becomes a third person in its agency, and it modulates our ways of being, our speaking tone, our body tonus. And with this image you gave of the amphitheater and those places, there are forms of psychotherapy or bodily psychotherapies which approach moments of, if you want, small or bigger trauma. And of course, you need to feel safe to begin to unravel bodily sensations or memories, which hold memories of your trauma. And it takes real great skills. But within those approaches, it is also, for example, it is said, it happened to me once, there is something, so where do you feel this thing that was a little quite painful and difficult to access? I had a bit of resistance, but I wanted to get there, and said, I described where in my lower tummy I feel that, and then she did, there a safe place. And I listened to my body, and I say yes, and she go to the safe place. And after a while, she says, can you now look at that place? And I could. And it was that pattern that was replicated by the Mona Hatoum Stephen Hall experience, but in some way, in a softer way, in what you describe. So I don't think that these connections have been made very often. And I very much hope that there are dozens of people around the world who are making similar observations now, because we need to change gear and get more into this.
But I also think that sometimes we are distracted, and I still think that there's lots of possibilities to transforming buildings which were not designed in such a considerate way to really transform them. And by the way we use them, by the way we approach them, I always believe that it's possible to make the monsters a bit nicer. I think it's possible to discover how it is, or what's at the core there. Something else that I wanted to bring to our conversations, and you, Marcus, you know that sometimes I'd like to make some controversial standpoints. So in this case, it's not really about controversy for the controversy's sake, but it's just that I would like to share an experience which might seem to come in opposition, but we can have a dialogue with this. And it's because you mentioned the work of Le Corbusier many times, and I know that, of course, Le Corbusier there are so many reasons to criticize him, which are very, very deserved.
Like it, of course.
But for example, also in the work of Johanni Palasma, very often there's, and also Harry Mulgrave, especially in his last book, Le Corbusier is heavily criticized. And I had an interesting email dialogue with Harry Mulgrave recently, review about his last book, because I think that Le Corbusier sometimes is not treated very fairly by our people of the body and architecture community. So I would just like to share one experience I had. We live in Stuttgart, so we are very close to the Weisen Siedlung. And I have to say that I have always been admirer of Le Corbusier's work and all his efforts, and especially his connection to painting. And I also came to learn through my first mentor, Eduard Cabral, that Le Corbusier was actually almost blind, which is something that not many people know. But we know his glasses, but sometimes we don't know. And I think that this explains a lot of his difficulties, and sometimes also the inflexibility, but some aspects of his paradoxical character. And I could kind of understand this through a very direct experience. It was the first time I went to the Weissenhofsiedlung. When the first encounter, we see this white, pure, rigid facade. And then we walk in there and we see the whole spectacle of color, which is by itself incredibly moving, and how it changes during the day. I have always loved color, and I wanted to be a painter also when I was growing up. So for me, it was a wonderful surprise, and it was quite a moving experience, because before I had actually written about Le Corbusier and being quite antagonistic also about his work and the rigidity of his urban planning and all of these things that we know, and all his failures. But that was quite already an intense experience. And then more recently, there was another occasion where I visited again Weissenhofsiedlung to show it to my nephew, who was just curious and he was growing up. And it was a time in my life where I was not in very good shape. I felt a bit depressed. And I didn't have any expectation with the building, but there was something about the experience of the color that had a really healing effect in my whole disposition. And later, I came home to our own place here in Stuttgart, which is a very nice 19th century building. And I thought, why do we have these white walls that look gray all the time? And I wouldn't stop until all those walls would have something close to that wonder of color that I experienced there at the Weisen. So I just wanted to bring this experience because maybe you have to come to Stuttgart and visit the Weisen.
I could say very quickly that I think it is Le Corbusier's urbanistic arrogance that puts so many people off, but one of the most beautiful, powerful, wonderful rooms I experienced is a monk's cell at La Tourette, where you have monks' rooms which are very oblong, unusually oblong, like almost counterintuitive, very small, like 2 meters wide, maybe 5 meters long. And in that small space, he creates a space that is breathing, I don't know how, like out of a miracle. And that in this small space, he creates 3 spaces, like a kind of antechamber where you wash, and it's sort of separated by cupboards. And then you have a space where the bed is, and a space with a little study. Each of them has a distinct identity when they are not all that well at all. So I bow my head to that capacity, of course.
Yes, I knew that you would tell us about this. Somehow my intuition was telling me I knew this will come. So I don't want to take any more of my time or with my own experiences, because I would really like to use the rest of our time to also engage in dialogue with our students. So I would love if you would please join and come to the owl and make a question or a comment.
You could dance if you want.
Or just in response, please. We need a little time for locomotion to get close to the owl.
Okay, I hope. Is it? You can hear me. I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe I can take out my mask.
Just for a moment, thank you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you a lot for your speech and for all the inputs you gave us. And I wanted to ask you, because for me, you are, because I of course study architecture, so it might be interesting for me to hear external perspective for some ways. So according to your idea, what should be the priority of someone who design a space in order to give formative or stimulating, moving experiences? So what should be the concrete priorities?
Wow. Well, that is a wonderful question. It's also a very, very big question. What I would say is that, of course, the architect needs to meet very concrete, practical, pragmatical priorities, and there are a hell of a lot of them. However, I would not give any guidelines. Guidelines can kill creativity and imagination and the capacity in an emphatic way to engage with the environment in which the new building is to be placed. So one sort of train of thought I can suggest to you is that when people read Ivani Pallasmaa and The Eyes of the Skin, one recognizes him kind of the world over as the architect who reclaims sensory experience. And so some people have in various areas, in disability design, in inclusive design, in architecture generally, have begun to talk about multi-sensory architecture. And in my thesis currently, I'm writing that, yes, on the whole, it is not wrong, but it doesn't go deep enough and doesn't understand exactly what Pallasmaa is about. And I will try to give a concrete, a kind of built of this example. We looked at the cherry tree at the windows, at the sensations in the auditorium or amphitheater and Le Corbusier's room. something in that space is animated. It works through sensations and other bodily perceptions, including interoceptions and proprioceptions. But it also then animates the life of the mind, of dream images, of sensory thoughts. It is a whole invisible dimension. And in Melasma's approach to that is that we need that kind of environment to engage with it and to be in a resonant place. Why do we need it in his approach? It is because our evolutionary history, which is roughly 4 billion years old, has actually made us want to have such resonant environments. A forest environment is much more alive than an architectural one, but architectural ones can be very alive. So I would say, from my point of view, and also in my thesis, but it's broadly a way of trying to highlight what Melasma has been doing, and others like a wonderful Italian architect, Francesca Torzo, whom I recommend thoroughly to all of you, with about 40-45, and is that honoring this invisible life of a building, which is made as the invisible stories and movements and sensations and feelings, which I would call also, in a sense, the pre-reflective space or the unconscious space. If we can design for that, we will be much happier people. We will also be able to be more healed more easily. It is those lean, sterile environments, and I'm not original in saying that. Hundreds of architects and critics have said that, which offer no space to engage with this invisible dimension, which make us tired, which create pathologies. And I say that not exactly in a medical sense. One would need to have more studies on that, but existentially, sensorially, I can definitely affirm that, and I think millions of us can. So it would be to really resensitize our bodies, provides a nurture to these experiences. What can we do for that? Read Bachelar's Poetics of Space, read Tanizaki's In Praise of Shadows, Im Lob des Schattens, read poetry, read literature, go to the fields, even do things that have nothing to do with architecture, because that's where that sensitivity grows, from which even the very synthetic, rational design becomes an embodied design, in the words of Sarah Williams Coldhagen, who writes wonderfully about Alvar Aalto in this book. And yeah, so that would be the direction I would recommend. Not being a designer and not knowing anything about the myriad difficulties and challenges you face in your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Any more questions or comments? This is your chance. Maybe one more question, because we are already a little ahead of the promised time. The group in the middle, we had such an interesting talk before about experiences and paying attention to subtle sensations. Maybe you would have a question or a comment in connection.
Meanwhile, I recommend reading Basho and haikus. That's a wonderful way of sensitizing oneself and becoming aware of the moment.
Well, yes, we have one. This is a gentle invitation.
We're very grateful and dankbar.
It's just because Hannes has made very interesting observations before.
So this lack of experience in our culture right now, I see it also as a consequence of having a lack of awareness of ourselves and our and a lack of presence in our being. I feel that a lot of times that I'm very disconnected from where I'm at, even from places, and all these sensations or these experiences come to me when I am aware where I'm at right now. So I think we could have a lot more of these experiences if we would be just more aware and present where we are right now, and not so much in our heads. Maybe, yeah, I think, I don't know if that's a solution, probably to create spaces where like you can escape your mind, like you get drawn to the here and now by them. Like if for example, I see something and I'm like, it has to really catch my attention to make myself aware of it, so I can have these experiences. So yeah. But I think, like, as a other solution, maybe we could just all get more aware of our, like, of the presence, and have way more experiences that way, even without something being so extraordinary that it like catches our attention right away.
Yeah,
I hope I made myself clear.
Yeah, it's very beautiful, and I think there are really ordinary experiences that we can rediscover. They may have nothing to do with architecture, but it is a matter of attentional attunement. And indeed, I think this big disconnect, many people feel that. My director of thesis, Claire Petit-Mongin, who also developed micro-phenomenology, she's a Buddhist practitioner, which I am not, but she writes about the fact that contact with lived experience has been severed. We have been separated from it, and that is also the cause of many ills. And in terms of everyday, or maybe more intense sensory experiences or aesthetic experiences, there is that difference between the attentional mode, which we usually tend to have. It's focused. It's also linked with a focused gaze as a focused vision. It is a little bit like this mit Scheuklappen, to be effective in the world. That's how one reduces the power of a horse or power of humans. And when, for example, you are in front of a flower, of a tree, of an animal, of a person you like, there's a moment when you see them, when you see the source of your perception. But there's a moment of more passive, that's the phenomenological word, or receptive attunement, where you feel a space in between you and the so-called object develop. And really, there's a kind of third phase. You could phenomenologically even document that, and my director of thesis had documented it on the study of the experience of a sound, together with musicologists and psychiatrists and so on. And the third stage is the one when things come to us. There's a moment of disponibility, of being present, but also being open to. And phenomenology in particular, Henri Maldenet in France, perhaps a little bit Heidegger in weird ways, but there is, I think Merleau-Ponty even, it's a moment of openness, where the so-called passive mode, which is not passive, it is receptive, where things come to us. And they can come also in places, for example, for me, Columba Museum is a place that was deliberately built by Zumthor and his design team to have us short circuit what is called higher level intellectual functions, and to leave the intellect, the rational intellect, at the coat hanger, at the entry of the museum. And it has design strategies, ways of designing that get you in touch with a somewhat unfamiliar yet highly welcoming environment. So you can let your hair down, and in being in something unusual, somewhat new, being brought in touch with your sensations, which means you're being put in touch with yourself as a sensate being. So greater awareness of self. It heightens awareness of the outside environment in the museum and in the city. So to me, it is just an extremely successful way of doing just what you've been talking about. Another one, it's a bit more fun to me with half Finnish, is that Alfa Alto writes about Finnish sauna, which is this other space, which is the most multi-sensory little space in which you are. And it takes you outside through the forest path onto the lake. And on the top of it, you can commune with nature, and you're being changed. You're also being physiologically cleansed. I think the lymphatic system gets cleansed up. And there again, you can find such spaces, but they are in your kitchen. They are even in hostile architecture, if we manage to care for it, as Maria said. So thanks for your question. I think for me, it goes beyond architecture. It's a question of meaning of life. What do we make with it?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we will have to finish for now. Thank you so much, Marcus, and also the students. Thank you for a wonderful contribution. It was really beautiful and also very inspiring, and also fun to have these topics in conversation and also in discussion. And I think for our students, this has been particularly enriching because we have had many conversations that go very much on the theoretical, also on the conceptual, but we needed something that would reinforce this experiential quality. We also have the experiential work, which is done outside of the classroom. So it's very, very important that we had your contribution.
Perhaps I can make an offer, but just to you as a group, if any one of you happens to be really interested in what a micro-phenomenology interview can do in making one connect with a past lived experience of a short span, I'm happy to offer one on Zoom. So you can contact Maria. It's not an obligation, but I can offer one or two of those if you wish.
Wonderful. I will share your contact, Marcus. Thank you so much for this kind and generous offer. We really have to finish for now, and thank you also for everybody who joined. I see Rulo is also still here, and thank you also for your patience and tolerance with all the technical difficulties we had. Okay, so we have to finish for now. So
Bleiben Sie gesund, bringen Sie Glück und Freude.
So thank you, Marcus. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you all. Et bonne soirée.
Bonne soirée, Marcus. Bye bye.